So Elad is maybe known most recently as the world's biggest solo venture capitalist,
I'm not that tall, but I appreciate it.
but has been involved in a variety of projects and companies over time. And I'm delighted that he's here. Sarah is so interesting to me too, the child of entrepreneurs who founded a communications equipment company, Casa Systems. She worked for them as a kid, like the children of entrepreneurs often do, and then went into investment banking, onto Greylock, where she became one of the first female general partners there, and then about a year ago announced that she had raised her own fund for Conviction Capital, which is really great. Congratulations on your one-year anniversary.
Thanks, Connie.
So, as a starting point, this whole sort of idea of solo GP is still kind of new and fascinating, especially at some of the scale that we're seeing, which is unprecedented. So, Elad, I know that you hate talking about numbers, but can you, as a starting point, just confirm, there were reports in November that you had closed a $1.1 billion third fund. Yes?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because you mentioned solo capitalism is a new thing, or there's all these articles about the rise of solo capitalists or things like that, and it's kind of interesting because if you go back through the history of venture, one of the things that I think is really striking is Arthur Rock for a long time, back in the 80s and part of the 70s, was investing by himself, and then in the 2000s you had a variety of people, Naval Ravikant, Michael Deering, a variety of folks. Sort of running various funds or investments or doing other things on their own. And so I think it's actually a very old concept. It's something that people have been doing for a long time. And then in parallel, there's a number of venture capital firms where there's somebody who's hired a small team, and that person really is the central decision maker, but it's called an institution. And so I think there's always been kind of this blurry or hazy line that maybe has more to do with branding than reality in terms of this trend. And so in many cases, I don't think a lot of this stuff is actually that new. And you've seen people with small funds, with big funds, with the whole range throughout, I think, the last 30, 40 years. I think it's.
Well, you're right that it's not new, but the scale is new. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this before. According to reports, you've raised about $2 billion since 2021.
I think there's a few firms that are called firms, but then you look into it and it's really like one person with some leverage. And in some cases, they have very large funds and billions under management and all the rest of it. And I think really it just comes down to, again, sort of how they're positioned or what the branding is or other things like that. So I think a lot of these trends it's interesting. When I invested in Airbnb, every couple years, what they were called shifted, even though they were doing the same thing. They were sharing economy, there were marketplaces, there were all sorts of things. And I think that's true of venture capital. Like a lot of things have been sort of repositioned over time, in part, I think, because people find it more interesting. Mm-hmm. But I think the reality is that, again, there's been these longer term trends that have just been ongoing. So I honestly think what I've been doing has gotten more attention than warranted. Like, I don't think it's that interesting, but I think it's fine if other people do. So.
It is interesting. Well, and Sarah, I want to know a little bit too about how you operate your firm. So I know that you're not completely alone, but virtually. Tell me a little bit about how Conviction operates. And maybe how much, I think you're investing a $100 million fund into AI companies?
Yeah, we have a baby little $100 million fund doing early stage AI investing. And we have 5 people today. So it's me, 2 investors, a talent partner, somebody working on sort of portfolio operations. And so I'm used to having a small but mighty team. I think Greylock is a relatively small partnership, but venture changes. A lot of the funds that were more focused on early stage over the last decade became much larger, multi-stage firms. And so I think the landscape of people actually focused on like early stage boutique investing is much thinner than it used to be.
And Elad, just to be clear, you still don't have, you don't have other investors on your staff.
Yeah, I don't have to be making investments. I've always had people who provided me with a little bit of leverage, like Shin Kim was my chief of staff before, and he went on to start a company, and so I've hired some people to sort of backfill that role. So I have people sort of on the team now, but they do a variety of things. Some of them are quite technical. So for example, My new chief of staff is Shreyan Jain, who joined me from Ramp, where he's an engineering manager. So he and another person, David Song, who dropped out of Stanford CS to join MemAI, have joined me, and the two of them have done things like they've built an embedding playground, so they basically swap in and out any underlying vector DB and any embedding framework so that we can play around with different tools. So they do a lot of stuff like that, which is really fun because then you can get really hands-on with like some of this really interesting new technology.
I'm so sorry. I'm actually having trouble hearing you, everybody, so loud. Guys, could you please just quiet down a little bit? I'm glad everybody's having fun, but...
Yeah, I feel very left out. I'm like,
I
should
know,
I like,
guys, let's
go
over
and
there.
interview
Party is
people?
over
I'm
here.
Like, how's it going? You know, like the...
Okay, not this, I promise last question, but this is, you and I talked in the spring, and this kind of blows my mind. As somebody who's been covering the industry for so long, so you're managing a substantial amount of money, and you can also still, I think you'd said, because I'd asked, like, how does it work? And you're like, well, sometimes I invest my personal money, and then if it's a bigger deal, I can invest my personal money, or I can use the fund money, or package together SPVs. So basically, you know, like, they've backed up the truck for you, your LPs, and then they've also said, whatever you want to do is fine as long as we get a piece of these deals.
Yeah, you know, I think fundamentally what I've learned in life in general, so for example, when my first company that I started was acquired by Twitter, one of the things that I pre-cleared was the ability to invest while at Twitter, and we had an agreement that anything that I wanted to do would go to the GC for approval.
Okay.
And if you didn't approve it in 5 days, I would just go ahead and do it.
Right.
And it was less about whether conflicts of interest existed or not, but more that they were disclosed, that there were bright lines, that there was clear guidelines. And so I think a lot of what I do now, I kind of took from that world of operating in terms of thinking through how do I make sure that everybody is clear in terms of what the intentions are, everybody understands how I'll operate, and nobody should ever question it because I'll always try to do the right thing. But I want to be very clear up front about what I'm doing and not doing and vice versa. And so I almost feel like anytime you have a business deal with someone, you almost want to create an upfront fiduciary contract. What do I owe you and what do you owe me and how are we going to work together over the long term? Because these things are hopefully multi-decade relationships for the set of people you work with over and over again over time. And so I think if you have that clarity of how you're going to act, and I often advise this to founders or executives I work with, it makes a huge difference. It gets rid of ambiguity, it gets rid of uncertainty, it gets rid of the feelings in it. Mm-hmm. And you just point to, here's what we discussed, and we wrote it down, and so everything's fine. And so I've taken that approach here as well.
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned from that. That's great. Well, both of you, I mean, people want to be in the business of, you know, Sarah and Elad Gil. For obvious reasons, you've got great portfolio companies historically and presently. You're an investor in Mistral, which is an OpenAI competitor that just raised something like $415 million from Andreessen and Lightspeed in December at a $2 billion valuation. I did want to ask, I mean, you're writing very regular checks, both of you. Lots of firms are coming in behind you, NEA, Sequoia, and these are big rounds, and these are really big valuations. I guess I just wondered, do you think the valuations in this space are getting ahead of themselves? We've seen this story play out time and again, or is there something fundamentally different here?
So I think you can do two things. One is you can look empirically at the outcomes that are happening, like outcomes. Like I think about real data that's either, you know, users or revenue or an enterprise value in the public markets, right? And in the interim of having like public AI native companies, we have OpenAI with, you know, publicly disclosed revenue numbers north of 1.5 billion now, and a lot of companies that have real traction in AI based on users and revenue. I forget what is public about Harvey, but it's a company that Elad and I are in together, and they had like a really good first year selling like legal Copilot. And so I'd say like, yes, there are definitely going to be companies that are very overpriced. I'd also say like I am biased in this point of view, but I'm a large investor in my own fund, right? Like I actually need the companies to work over time. And like I think there is real customer value. I did a reference with a end user of one of my portfolio companies the other day, and he was telling me that he went to a trade show to look for a solution that did what this company offers because he thought it was so important to his business. And I'm like, that, you know, he doesn't care what investors think or what the hype cycle is. He just sees an opportunity. And I think the capability set's quite powerful.
Can I also ask Sarah? So you're investing $100 million. Everything counts. How are you investing that money? I mean, how many portfolio companies do you aim to have at the end of this fund?
Yeah, I feel very lucky in that I guess this goes to like less planned investment strategy. When I left Greylock, I said, I don't know much more than I want to do early stage investing. I like being very hands-on with companies. I like working with them as they scale as well, but I like being there early. And then I know how portfolio math works in terms of like more ownership means better returns. And so I was very lucky to have a set of LPs that were very long-term oriented and didn't want much more information than that. And so if we just go back to Elad's framework of like what is the I guess like financial agreement, mine with my LPs was like, I think I'll have a relatively concentrated portfolio. We're going to be doing early stage investments and I promise to make you money. So I didn't commit to a certain construction. And I think we're figuring it out as we go.
Elad, if you don't mind my asking, because you do have a lot of money to deploy, I'm guessing because you won't confirm it. What are the like biggest checks that you're writing? What AI company has raised the most money from you?
It depends on how you define AI. I mean, maybe Anduril.
Anduril?
Yeah,
Okay.
the defense tech company. I mean, I've been investing with them and working with them since their seed round. So I met them when it was just the 4 founders. And then I participated in almost every round since then. I led their Series D, which I think was a $450 million round, not from me, but overall as a round. But there's a variety of companies that I've invested with over time where I just invested early and then kept going. Stripe would be another example of that. Samsara, I invested in multiple rounds. That's now a public company. And a number of them are sort of prior generation of AI driven, right? Samsara is an AI company coupled with hardware. Anduril is an AI company coupled to hardware. So I think those may be 2 examples.
Great. I also wanted to just talk to you about some of your portfolio companies because I'm still trying to figure out how different these companies are than predecessors. One of yours is Perplexity, which has raised more money from NEA. So this is a company that's trying to take on search. Essentially, it's taking on, Bing, and which I guess is not that hard to do, maybe, and Google. But what gives you the faith that this company can, is a sustainable enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So I invested in Perplexity. I actually led their pre-seed round when it was just Arvind, the founder. And so I heard that he was very smart. He reached out to me, and I pinged. He worked with Peter Abil at Berkeley, and I pinged Peter, and Peter was like, this is one of the smartest people who's worked with me. And so we started meeting and brainstorming ideas. And originally, he was going to go in a very different direction in terms of being a next-gen sort of data co-pilot. And as he was iterating on the product, more and more people kind of wanted to use it for search, and he just followed that pull of what people wanted. And he ended up building this really interesting research and search and answer tool. And fundamentally, there's a variety of ways to think about it. I think one of them is basically some proportion of share of search, and a tiny fraction of search is still a massive market. So it could just be TAM centric. I think it's Pierre Lamond. I don't know if you've ever. Yeah, Pierre is. I think he's 80 years old now or something. He's still working, and amazing person who operated for decades and then joined Sequoia. And he was a partner at Sequoia. And one of the things he always used to say was that, and I'm sure he still says, again, he's still working. I don't want to make it sound like posthumous when it isn't. Is that he'd much rather be in a giant TAM going after a small piece of it than in a small TAM with a big piece of it, because at least in a giant TAM, there's always room to move around. There's room to expand. You always have kind of headway. And in a tiny TAM or total addressable market, you get constrained by the market and then you get stuck. Yeah. And I think Perplexity is a great example where even a small slice of this massive market could be quite interesting. And I think Arvind is one of the most talented people I've worked with in quite some time. And in general, I should say, in the AI world, one of the things that's been amazing over the last 2-3 years that I've been doing generative AI, and I've been doing AI investing for maybe 15 years now, is how good people are again, like how good the founders are. There's been a huge step up in terms of drive, hours worked, intelligence, ambition, genuine organic salesmanship, right? And so I think the level of founders, and that's, a variety of people that I've backed over the last 2-3 years. I've been very impressed by them, and Arvind is one of those people who keeps stepping up, incredibly smart, very aggressive, cares a lot about what he's building, cares a lot about his users. And I think when you see things like that, those usually lead to very good companies and good outcomes.
And I'm sorry, I don't know this. Is he a serial entrepreneur?
No, this was his first startup. He did his PhD at Berkeley, and then he went to OpenAI.
Okay.
And then he started this out of OpenAI.
Got it. Yeah, you mentioned Peter Abiel. And I wanted to talk to you, Sarah, about Mistral. So it's going up against some stiff competition. It publicly released its tech so that people can develop their own chatbots. OpenAI and others said this is not, necessarily responsible. Just wondering what you think about that. Like,
This is not responsible.
yeah, not responsible.
Yeah.
I mean, the threat of disinformation, et cetera.
The threat of abusive use.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I would start with I think all technology that is like general platform technology can be used by actors good and bad, right? And the question is just like where those safeguards sit and who gets to determine what is good and bad and who gets to use it. Because they have to sit somewhere. I think traditionally, like, we don't figure out how to restrict the internet. We figure out how to restrict applications on the internet. And what that allows for is like a million flowers to bloom. All of the applications that we want to use, people can put them online in a decentralized way, and then we can decide which ones, when they grow and are impactful, are responsible to society in some way and should be constricted or face obligations. I think mostly people feel software should generally operate that way. I think the Mistral point of view is they care a great deal about safety, but there is a balance between safety and innovation, and it's not clear that a very small number of labs with a very small number of decision makers should make the decisions about safety if you draw that parallel to the internet.
Do you worry that they're French and therefore may impose French values on the rest of the world?
Yeah.
4-hour work week, wine for lunch. Like, that's the thing I'm worried about with Mistral, actually, is the potential for that to happen. And so I wonder if we should kind of shut them down.
Such a French alarmist.
When I go to
very,
bed,
sacre bleu, it's like, it's just, so I don't know, that's my concern.
Okay, I will say, so talking about being alarmist, I mean, I do wonder as investors, just generally speaking, when you are funding these companies, yes, a lot of people will say it's the end of the world, whereas AI taking us, you'll say that's not, don't worry about it. But, I mean, if things are used for purposes they weren't intended for, like, how do you protect yourselves if you're involved with these companies and they're...
It's really interesting because if you look at the history of the 20th century, if you look at AI safety, there's really 3 areas. One area is like digital risk, misinformation, bias, things like that. A second area is physical risk. Can an AI make a virus? Can it do bad things to you? Can it create a bomb, whatever, derail a train? And then the third is existential risk. Like, are we worried that there will be some species competition over time, right? And people tend to mix those 3 risks. And some people will shout about regulation because they're worried about the existential stuff, but they realize that the misinformation and everything else is stuff that we've dealt with in other contexts throughout the history of humanity, honestly. If you go back to the 20th century and you go through each one of those risks, misinformation, we had the Spanish-American War because of yellow journalism. Physical risk, we had 2 world wars, we had mass famine. Existential risk, we had genocides and attempted genocides repeatedly. Humans did that without AI. People did that to each other. And so I think we need to remember that the thing that is the biggest threat to us in the short run is other people. And we see that increasingly in the global theaters in terms of everything that we're seeing in current events right now. And I think people kind of forgot that. And so I think it's really important to kind of reground and say, okay, what are we actually worried about? Why? Do we already have tools and legal frameworks for it? And in the context of misinformation and other things we do. And then how do we think about these threats evolving over time relative to the arc of progress, the arc of technology, and also, most importantly, the arc of humanity? Because at least right now, I'm dramatically more worried about other people than I am about AI. Although in the long run, I think AI could be an issue.
I'm sorry, I'm still having a little bit of trouble hearing you, but I heard most of that. I wanted to ask about foundational models. I think when we talked, you'd said you kind of I don't know if you'd said you avoided them or you hadn't really funded them, but I wondered, if that was by choice or circumstance, I'm guessing that you could have if you.
Yeah, I've made some foundation model investments over time. So Mistral, despite the French thing,
Okay.
is one. There's other. It was a big hurdle, right?
Oh, is
I had
it?
to. Yeah, I was
asked
up
the
late at
question.
night. You know, I was kind of questioning, what if the values spread? What if it's French Canadian values? Is that good or bad? And you know, yeah, exactly. They have poutine, so you're like, that's a good thing. But it's also Canada. So, you know, you kind of go back and forth on these things, and it's a lot of late nights, a lot of drinking. You know, I don't want to talk about it, actually. I think it's TMI right now. But, but I think if you look at, I think one of the things that's very under-discussed is the breadth of things on the foundation model layer, right? So there's the big LLMs. There's image gen models. There's video. There's audio on the diffusion model side, as well as some transformer stuff. There's all the various biology models. There's chemistry models now, material sciences, robotics. And so there's so much to do with the foundation model layer in so many different ways. And some of these are going to forward integrate into applications, right? That's OpenAI and ChatGPT. That's a variety of things. But some of them will also vertically integrate in biology and healthcare. And they may vertically integrate in robotics. And then some of them will just be standalone models. And so I think the future world is this really interesting mishmash. And to me, the biggest wild card right now that I don't understand is what happens with Meta's investment in Llama. And there's a few scenarios that could happen there. And really the way to think about LLMs is what's at the frontier and what's behind it. The frontier most advanced model right now is GPT-4. And this year there's going to be at least 4 companies that are likely to launch a GPT-4 level model. And I think OpenAI, and I don't have inside knowledge about this, but I'm assuming OpenAI will hit like GPT-5 or 4.5 or whatever. They should be a step ahead, because they've been so far ahead against everybody. But the question is, 5 years from now, does Llama catch up? And do we have an open source model that is as good as any closed source model? And if so, that creates somewhat of a flip in the ecosystem, because the value will go in part, it'll still stay with the foundation models, but it'll also migrate to the cloud providers. The hyperscalers who are running these models will absorb a broader share of dollars. And that's a really big shift if it happens. And so I think there's a lot of very big unanswered questions that are both really interesting intellectually, but also make certain investments difficult to understand or contemplate. And sometimes, as a founder or as an investor, you have to take the leap. And sometimes you say, well, the world is uncertain enough that I'm also okay waiting. And so I think that's one of the big open questions about foundation models.
That's really interesting. I mean, I keep thinking there's going to be an oligopoly, but maybe the players are different than I'm guessing they're going to be. I guess also, you know, so we're all guessing, but like in 10 years, will it still look like it does today, where we have some power players and then the hierarchy kind of looks the same? Or do you think we could live in a world where there are just the 3 power players and that's it? I mean, how do you?
Yeah.
Sarah, what do you think?
I don't know anybody that works in AI today that is comfortable making a 10-year prediction. I think most people are pretty uncomfortable making a 2-year prediction, actually, just in terms of pace of change in the industry. And so, like, as somebody who, was a seed and Series A investor in Mistral, like, I'm going to honestly say I am shocked at how effective models at the, like, small or 8 by 7B size are, right? And if you just take this framework of like what's at the frontier, what's behind the frontier, and behind the frontier, you're gonna have very capable things that are open source. I think that the question you ask is really complicated because there is a version of this that's an AGI future where like I don't know that there's 3 players, maybe there's 1, right? I think there's a version of it where the availability of Llama 2 and Mistral have enabled a whole generation of application companies to explore like new use cases that are much more sophisticated. And it is very, very hard for a single foundation model player to go do the product and distribution and post-training and data collection to get into all of the crannies of the universe that use technology or could use more AI. And so I think there's a $1 trillion of value to be created and captured in all of these different applications, and I think it's very unlikely that most of it goes to a few players. I think the foundation model layer is likely to be very important no matter what. I think the open source movement has changed my view of how much of an oligopoly it's going to stay.
You agree?
I think at the frontier, it's most likely an oligopoly, and then behind that, it's fragmented.
Great. Guys, thank you so much for joining me. So fun. And thank you for not making fun of you for mispronouncing Mistral.
Thanks for having us.
Miss
Really a treat. Thank you so much.